I have atrial pressure, which is the pressure in the atria, and I've got ventricular pressure, the dotted lines, that is the pressure in the ventricle. To decide whether a valve is open or closed, I need to know the pressure on either side of that valve. So the atrial and the ventricular pressures tell me the state of an AV valve. The ventricular and the aortic pressure tells me the state of a semilunar valve. Now, as this is happening, time is moving in this direction, and it's less than a second because most people have a heart rate of 70 or so. But 70% of the blood fills the ventricles passively from the atria, just because the blood's flowing in the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and gravity is keeping the AV valves open. So pressure is almost zero, if not zero, in the atria and in the ventricles. But the pressure has to be greater in the atria than in the ventricles, so the AV valves open. Now the cardiac cycle starts in earnest, and I enter into atrial systole. The atria are going through systole, the volume is decreasing, and I'm pushing the last 30% of the blood into the ventricle. Well, if I'm decreasing the volume, or decreasing the volume, I'm increasing the pressure. That's why it goes up there. But the pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the ventricles. So the valve is open, blood goes in. Now, this dot right here, carefully marked B with an arrow, nice job, marks the beginnings of ventricular systole. 1 millisecond, the ventricle starting to contract. 2 milliseconds, the ventricle starting to contract even more. And what's happening to the pressure in the ventricle? It's going up. About 3 milliseconds, and now the pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure in the atria. The dot is above the dash. Well, if the pressure in the ventricle is greater than the pressure in the atria, what happens? The AV valve closes, and that creates heart sound 1. That's why the line is after ventricular systole starts, but ventricular systole is about 300 milliseconds because of that calcium. Now, the pressure in the ventricle is less than the pressure in the aorta. The semilunar valves are also closed. Between lines 1 and 2, as it says, you have 2 phases in ventricular systole. This is the isovolumetric. No blood can get into the ventricle, no blood can get out of the ventricle because both sets of valves are closed. And now the pressure goes up quite quickly because fluids don't compress. And now, as soon as the pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure in the aorta, what happens?
So aorta semilunar.
The aortic, the semilunar is open, and I'm in the second phase of ventricular systole. Between lines 2 and 3 is ejection. Where's the blood going? Into the aorta. But as you know, even though the ventricle is contracting more and more and more with less blood in the ventricle, eventually the pressure is going to ebb, so it starts to go down. Whether I'm still in ventricular systole or not, if the pressure in the ventricle drops below the pressure in the aorta, the semilunars close, heart sound 2, line 3. All right? Back down here, the atria are in diastole, but the pressure in the atria is going up. And C, which is over here, says, why is the pressure going up in the atria? Well, you got AV valves, chordae tendineae, and the muscle mass in the ventricle is tremendous. The muscle mass in the atria, bupkas. And as the pressure's building up during isovolumetric, it's like squeezing on the side of a balloon and you're getting a bubble. Well, you're bulging the AV valves up into the confines of the atrium. That's reducing volume. That's giving you that false increase in pressure. Okay? But they're not going to prolapse because what AV valves have, chordae tendineae, and they're anchored into the papillary muscle, which is in the middle of systole. So they're contracting to make sure it doesn't prolapse.
Okay.
As soon as the valve, the semilunar, is open, this drops to 0. Does that make sense? Now, if you look, the semilunar valves open, the semilunar valves close, and I get a gradual increase in atrial blood pressure. Why do I get this linear, slow increase? Venous return. The superior vena cava is still bringing blood back to the atria. The inferior vena cava is bringing blood back to the atria. The coronary sinus is getting blood squished through systole into the right atrium, and the same would be true for the pulmonary side. And that, well, I'm putting more and more blood into a chamber that isn't open. And what happens? Put more and more air into your car tire, the pressure goes up, but it goes up gradually. It continues to go up even after the semilunar valves close, because now the ventricle does go into diastole, but if the pressure in the ventricle is greater than the pressure in the atria, the AV valves are closed until you get that overlapping period of mutual diastole where the pressure is 0, then the valves open, and now everybody flows passively into the ventricle. But at the same time as the semilunar valve closes, the pressure in the aorta goes up. And that kind of makes no sense because you figure everything was ejected. But I've been talking about a vessel that's smaller in diameter than my index finger. And in a third of a second, I put 70 mLs of blood, and diastolic volume, systolic volume, through there. And what happened? It expanded just from ejection. But the tunica media of any artery is loaded with smooth muscle, and I got an internal elastic membrane in the tunica interna, passive recoil. And so as you bulge out, once the door closes, you get that return back to the normal size due to the muscle. Well, if I'm decreasing the size of the lumen, I'm increasing the pressure, because that's decreasing. But that's really quite nice, because as soon as the semilunar valves close, the 2 coronary arteries are now open for blood. And the little bit of pressure here pushes the little blood that's left at the bottom of the aorta into the coronary circulation. At the same time, the muscle's relaxing, so this is like taking a sponge and letting it open up into a bucket. I'm going to suck the blood into the coronary circuit. The only organ in the entire body that doesn't get perfused through systole is the heart. When does it get it? Only during ventricular diastole, because it's got to be the ventricles, because I have to open up the ports to the coronaries. Atrial systole or diastole, I'll perfuse, but I won't get the blood flowing into the coronary circuit. So, and as I go into ventricular systole or atrial systole, I squeeze the blood out of the capillaries, pushing it into the coronary sinus, and it's forcing it right back into the atrium. Does that make sense? So
There's
I'm going to do things. Yes, there's a lot there. So, but I'm not going to give you the graph. So if I said, oh, the pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the ventricle, what's the state of the AV valve? What produces heart sound 1? The closing of the
AV valve.
What produces heart sound 2?
Closing the semilunar.
Now,
So this is
what
like,
causes, okay, I'll answer your question in a second. What causes the slight increase in aortic pressure after the closing of the semilunar valve?
The recoil of the tunica media.
And so if you read, the dichroic notch is the elastic recoil of the tunica media of the aorta. There's a lot of good information hidden over here with all that there. Your question.
so this is like the, what is it, the P wave?
No, you can't do a
You
thing.
can't do
You
it?
can't do a thing with this. This is muscle contraction.
But doesn't that have to do with like depolarization and repolarization? Or am I just putting too much onto the graph?
You're
That's-
trying to put, that's going to be up here on the chart. I'll bring up that curve in a second on the screen just so you can see it. But for a cardiac cycle to happen, I need to have the depolarization of the atria, the depolarization of the ventricles, the repolarization of the atria, the repolarization of the ventricles. That electrical conductance then is followed by contraction. So an EKG measures electrical conductance. You can assume, if you can hear a heartbeat in your patient, that the heart's functioning. But you can't say this is P, this is Q, RS. So give me a second.